Marco Santelli stared at the eviction notice taped to his apartment door, the red ink seeming to mock him in the dim hallway light. 28 years old, recently fired from his third job in 6 months, and now facing homelessness. His neighbors walked past without making eye contact, as if poverty might be contagious. But something stirred within Marco that day. Not despair, but a cold, calculating anger that would reshape his entire existence. Born in the cramped tenements of South Philadelphia, Marco had learned early that the world operated on brutal mathematics. His father, a factory worker who drank away his paycheck, had taught him through bitter example that honest work alone would never lift a man above his circumstances. His mother cleaned office buildings at night, her hands cracked and bleeding from chemicals, yet still struggled to keep food on the table. By age 12, Marco understood that society's promises of reward for hard work were lies told to keep people docile. The first lesson came when he was 14. His high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Henderson, had pulled him aside after seeing his test scores. "You have real potential, Marco," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescending kindness he had grown to despise. "But you need to apply yourself more. Success comes to those who follow the rules and work hard." Marco nodded politely, but inside he was studying her. Mrs. Henderson drove a BMW while his teachers took second jobs to make ends meet. She preached meritocracy while her own position came through her husband's connections to the school board. That day, Marco learned his first Machiavellian truth: never trust the advice of those who profit from your compliance. Standing in that hallway with the eviction notice, Marco remembered another moment that had shaped him. At 19, he had watched his Uncle Tony, a man who played by every rule, paid every tax, and believed in every promise, lose his house when the company he had served faithfully for 23 years decided his department was redundant. Uncle Tony had broken down crying at the kitchen table, bewildered by a world that had betrayed his faith. Marco had sworn then that he would never be that vulnerable, never place his fate in hands that could so easily close into fists. The apartment was nearly empty anyway. Marco owned little beyond clothes, a few books, and a laptop that barely functioned. But his mind was his greatest asset, and it was working furiously as he walked through the cramped rooms one last time. He had been thinking about this moment for years, preparing for the day when conventional life would finally reveal its true bankruptcy. The eviction notice was not a disaster. It was liberation from the illusion that playing by other people's rules would ever serve him. Marco had spent his 20s observing, learning, and, most importantly, understanding the gap between what society claimed to value and what it actually rewarded. He watched managers get promoted for taking credit for their subordinates' work. He saw companies preach family values while ruthlessly discarding employees the moment profit margins tightened. He noticed how the same politicians who spoke about integrity in public enriched themselves through backroom deals. The pattern was everywhere once you learned to see it. Those who succeeded were not the most honest or hardworking, but the most strategically minded. His last job had been at a marketing firm where he had observed his boss, Jennifer Walsh, operate with surgical precision. She never lied outright, but she shaped truth like clay, molding narratives that serve her purposes. When a company faced budget cuts, she had methodically documented every minor mistake her colleagues made while positioning herself as indispensable. Marco had watched her sacrifice 3 good employees to save her own position, and he had felt no moral outrage, only professional admiration. Jennifer understood the game in ways that his Uncle Tony never could. But Marco also noticed Jennifer's weaknesses. She was brilliant at internal politics, but lacked vision beyond the next quarterly report. She protected her position jealously, but never built anything lasting. Most critically, she had made the mistake of believing her own performance. She thought she was succeeding through merit rather than manipulation. This blindness would eventually destroy her, Marco realized, but her techniques were worth studying and improving upon. The night before his eviction, Marco sat in his empty apartment with a notebook, writing down everything he had learned about power, influence, and survival. The list filled 12 pages, but certain principles emerged as fundamental. First, never let others control your narrative. Second, always have more information than your opponents. Third, build value that others cannot easily replace. Fourth, never reveal your true capabilities until the moment of maximum advantage. Fifth, cultivate relationships based on mutual benefit, not sentiment. As dawn broke over Philadelphia, Marco packed his few belongings into a duffel bag and walked out of his old life forever. But he was not fleeing. He was advancing toward a battlefield he had chosen. His destination was New York City, where he planned to test every principle he had learned against the most ruthless competition in America. He had exactly $437, no connections, and no safety net. According to conventional wisdom, he was courting disaster. According to Machiavellian logic, he was finally positioning himself for victory. The bus ride to New York gave Marco time to refine his strategy. He would not repeat the mistakes that had brought him low. No more trusting employers to value his contributions. No more believing that competence alone would be recognized and rewarded. No more allowing others to define his worth or limit his possibilities. Instead, he would become someone who understood how the world actually worked and used that knowledge without apology or hesitation. He thought about Niccolò Machiavelli himself, writing The Prince while exiled from Florence, broke, and seemingly powerless. Yet Machiavelli had understood something that most people never grasped. Strength was not about noble intentions or moral purity. Strength was about effectiveness, about achieving your goals regardless of how others judge your methods. The powerful wrote history and defined virtue. The powerless simply endured whatever definitions were imposed upon them. Marco arrived in New York City with no illusions about the challenge ahead. The city was filled with people just as intelligent and ambitious as himself, many with advantages he lacked. But they also carried something he had discarded, the burden of believing that life should be fair. This belief would make them vulnerable in ways they would never recognize until it was too late. While they waited for merit to be rewarded and justice to prevail, Marco would be building the kind of power that made such things irrelevant. His first night was spent in a youth hostel in the Bowery, surrounded by backpackers and broke artists who spoke dreamily about their big breaks and lucky chances. Marco listened to their conversations with anthropological fascination. These people were operating on hope and fantasy, waiting for external forces to recognize their specialness and lift them up. They had no understanding of how thoroughly they had been trained to be passive consumers of their own lives. But Marco was different. He had been forged in failure and tempered by betrayal. He understood that the world respected only one thing: results. And he was about to demonstrate exactly what a man could accomplish when he stopped caring about anything except winning. His journey from homeless nobody to master of his own destiny was about to begin, and he would let nothing, neither conscience nor convention, stand in his way. The next morning, Marco stood in Times Square watching thousands of people rush to jobs that barely paid their bills, following rules that enriched everyone except themselves. They moved like sleepwalkers through a dream someone else had designed for them. But Marco was awake now, perhaps for the first time in his life. And being awake in a world of sleepwalkers was the greatest advantage a man could possess. His transformation would not happen overnight, but it would be total. By the time he was finished, Marco Santelli would become living proof that a man with the right knowledge and the will to use it could forge a life that no storm could break. The weak would call him ruthless. The naive would call him immoral. But they would all call him powerful, and in the end, that was the only judgment that mattered. Marco walked toward the subway, his reflection caught in a shop window, showing a man who looked the same, but was fundamentally changed. The old Marco had died in that cramped Philadelphia apartment. What walked the streets of New York now was something harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. The real education of Marco Santelli was about to begin, and the world would never be ready for what he would become. Marco's first apartment in New York was a basement room in Queens that flooded every time it rained. The ceiling leaked, the walls had suspicious stains, and his neighbors included a drug dealer and an elderly woman who screamed at invisible enemies all night. But Marco felt no shame about his circumstances. Shame was a luxury he could not afford, and, more importantly, it was a weakness that others could exploit. Instead, he saw the basement as his war room, the place where he would plan his conquest of a city that crushed the unprepared. His initial months in New York were spent in careful reconnaissance. While other newcomers rushed into the first opportunities they found, Marco invested his time studying the ecosystem he wanted to dominate. He haunted public libraries, reading business journals and financial reports until he could identify patterns invisible to casual observers. He attended free networking events not to make friends, but to map the social hierarchies that govern Manhattan's elite circles. Most importantly, he listened, absorbing every conversation, cataloging every name, and noting every weakness people revealed about themselves and their organizations. The breakthrough came when Marco realized that information was the ultimate currency in New York, more valuable than money because it could generate money indefinitely. He began systematically gathering intelligence on key players in industries that interested him. Not gossip or rumors, but hard facts about business relationships, financial pressures, and personal vulnerabilities. He learned which executives were having affairs, which companies were facing hidden cash flow problems, and which promising startups were about to lose their major investors. This knowledge became his seed capital. Marco's first real opportunity arose through patient observation of a small financial consulting firm called Meridian Analytics. The founder, David Kessler, was brilliant but naive, exactly the type of person Marco had learned to identify and exploit. Kessler genuinely believed that superior analysis and honest recommendations would naturally attract clients and generate success. He was slowly going bankrupt while maintaining his principles, unable to understand why his competitors with inferior products were thriving. Rather than apply for a job directly, Marco spent 3 weeks studying Kessler's business model and client base. He identified the specific problems that were destroying the company's profitability and developed detailed solutions that Kessler would never implement on his own. Then, Marco arranged to accidentally encounter Kessler at a coffee shop near the office, striking up a conversation about market trends that gradually revealed his deep understanding of the industry's hidden dynamics. The conversation lasted 4 hours, with Marco carefully demonstrating his value while making Kessler feel like he was discovering these insights himself. By the end of their meeting, Kessler was convinced that hiring Marco would solve his business problems. Marco negotiated not just a salary, but equity in the company and complete freedom to implement his strategies without oversight. Kessler thought he was getting a dedicated employee. In reality, he was surrendering control of his life's work to someone who understood power in ways he never would. Within 6 months, Marco had transformed Meridian Analytics from a failing consultancy into a profitable operation. But his methods bore no resemblance to Kessler's ethical approach. Marco discovered that their biggest competitor was using inside information from a corrupt SEC official to gain trading advantages. Instead of reporting this illegality, Marco gathered detailed evidence and used it to blackmail the competitor into steering clients toward Meridian. When a potential client seemed hesitant to commit, Marco would casually mention problems at their current firm that only someone with insider knowledge could know, creating the impression that Meridian possessed supernatural analytical abilities. Marco's most audacious move involved deliberately sabotaging a competitor's presentation to a major pharmaceutical company. He learned through careful surveillance that the competitor's lead analyst had a gambling addiction and significant debts. Marco arranged for the man to receive an anonymous tip about a sure-thing horse race, knowing the analyst would bet money he didn't have and lose. The resulting financial pressure caused the analyst to have a nervous breakdown during the crucial presentation, allowing Meridian to secure a contract worth $8 million over 3 years. David Kessler remained oblivious to Marco's methods, choosing to believe that their sudden success resulted from improved analytical techniques and better market positioning. This willful blindness suited Marco perfectly. Kessler provided legitimate cover for operations that would have triggered investigations if conducted openly. Meanwhile, Marco was building a network of contacts who owed him favors, feared his knowledge, or could be manipulated through carefully applied pressure. The transformation in Marco's circumstances was dramatic but carefully concealed. He moved to a luxury apartment in Manhattan, but maintained a modest lifestyle that would not attract attention or questions. He wore expensive clothes, but in subtle styles that suggested old money rather than nouveau riche desperation. Most importantly, he cultivated the persona of a brilliant but slightly naive analyst, someone smart enough to be valuable, but not threatening enough to be eliminated. People trusted him with sensitive information because they underestimated his capacity to use it against them. Marco's social life became another theater of operations. He dated women who worked at competing firms, law offices, and government agencies, extracting useful intelligence during intimate conversations while maintaining emotional distance. He joined exclusive clubs and attended charity galas not for pleasure, but to map the relationships between powerful people and identify their pressure points. Every interaction served multiple purposes. Every friendship was an investment, and every confidence shared became a potential weapon. The most crucial lesson Marco learned during this period was that most powerful people were far more vulnerable than they appeared. The executives who seemed untouchable often depended on illegal or unethical practices that could destroy them if exposed. The politicians who projected strength were frequently compromised by financial obligations or personal scandals. The socialites who defined Manhattan's cultural hierarchy were desperate to maintain positions that depended on others' approval. Understanding these vulnerabilities allowed Marco to navigate elite circles with confidence, knowing that everyone had something to hide and everyone could be influenced if you pressed the right buttons. By his second year in New York, Marco had established himself as an indispensable figure in Meridian's success while building a parallel network of relationships that existed independently of his official position. He had learned to speak the language of power fluently, understanding that true influence came not from titles or formal authority, but from possessing information and relationships that others needed. He could destroy careers with a phone call, create opportunities with an introduction, or solve problems that seemed impossible through creative application of pressure and incentives. But Marco's greatest achievement was maintaining his psychological autonomy while operating in environments designed to corrupt or co-opt anyone who entered them. He watched colleagues become addicted to luxury, status, and approval from people they claimed to despise. He saw competitors destroy themselves through greed, arrogance, or the mistaken belief that temporary advantages were permanent victories. Marco avoided these traps by remembering his core principles and never losing sight of his ultimate objectives. The basement apartment in Queens became a symbol of how far he had traveled, but also a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. Marco never forgot that his position was built on knowledge, relationships, and reputation, assets that required constant maintenance and could be lost through complacency or miscalculation. This awareness kept him sharp, focused, and always 3 steps ahead of potential threats to his carefully constructed empire. As Marco stood in his Manhattan office 2 years after arriving in New York with $400 and a duffel bag, he reflected on the distance he had traveled. But this was only the beginning. He had mastered the fundamentals of power and influence, but true security required something more ambitious: the ability to shape the game itself rather than simply playing by rules others had established. The next phase of his evolution would test everything he had learned and transform him from a skilled player into a master of the entire system. Marco understood that he was living proof of Machiavelli's central insight. The human nature and social systems operated according to predictable patterns that could be studied, understood, and exploited by anyone with the intelligence and determination to do so. Conventional morality was a luxury for people who could afford to lose. For someone like Marco, who had started with nothing and had everything to gain, moral constraints were simply obstacles to be overcome through superior strategy and unwavering commitment to results. The city that had seemed impossibly vast and intimidating when he first arrived now felt like a puzzle he was solving piece by piece. And with each success, each carefully executed manipulation, each strategic victory, Marco was building something that no storm could break. A life based on power rather than permission, knowledge rather than hope, and results rather than intentions. The weak would never understand what he had become, but they would respect it, and ultimately that was all that mattered. Marco's ultimate test came when David Kessler decided to sell Meridian Analytics to a massive consulting conglomerate called Titan Strategic. The acquisition would make Kessler wealthy, but leave Marco as a mid-level employee in a bureaucratic corporation where his specialized skills would be wasted and his independence eliminated. For most people, this would represent a setback requiring years to overcome. For Marco, it was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate how thoroughly he had mastered the art of turning apparent disasters into strategic victories. The moment Kessler announced the potential sale, Marco activated a plan he had been developing for over a year. He had anticipated this possibility and quietly prepared for it by documenting every irregular practice at competing firms, every instance of client manipulation, and every violation of securities regulations he had discovered during his intelligence-gathering operations. More importantly, he had carefully positioned himself to become indispensable to Meridian's most valuable clients, not through official relationships, but through personal trust and demonstrated results that could not easily be replicated. Marco's first move was to schedule private meetings with Meridian's 3 largest clients, ostensibly to discuss how the acquisition might affect their ongoing projects. During these conversations, he revealed carefully selected information about Titan Strategic's history of acquiring smaller firms, stripping away their specialized capabilities and delivering standardized services that bore no resemblance to what had made the original company valuable. He presented this information not as criticism of Kessler's decision, but as concern for the client's interests and a desire to ensure continuity during the transition. Within a week, all 3 clients had called Kessler to express serious reservations about the acquisition. They made it clear that their contracts contained clauses allowing them to terminate agreements if service quality declined, and they specifically requested assurances that Marco would continue handling their accounts personally. Kessler found himself in the awkward position of needing to guarantee something he had no power to control once Titan took over the company. While Kessler was dealing with client concerns, Marco was executing the second phase of his strategy. He arranged a series of carefully orchestrated leaks to financial journalists about Titan Strategic's questionable practices, including their habit of inflating revenues through accounting manipulation and their pattern of using acquisition targets' client relationships to cross-sell inferior products at premium prices. The stories were factual, but selectively presented to create maximum damage to Titan's reputation just as they were preparing to announce the Meridian acquisition. The media attention triggered a broader investigation into Titan's business practices, with securities regulators beginning preliminary inquiries into several of their recent transactions. Suddenly, the company that had seemed like a perfect acquirer for Meridian was facing potential legal problems that made any new acquisition extremely risky. Titan's executives found themselves explaining to their board why they wanted to buy a small consulting firm while their core business was under regulatory scrutiny. Kessler was devastated as his dream of a profitable exit evaporated, but Marco was just beginning to reveal the true scope of his planning. Over the past 18 months, he had been quietly cultivating relationships with several former Meridian clients who had left for various reasons, but remained impressed with the quality of analysis they had received. Marco had maintained contact with these executives, occasionally providing informal advice that proved remarkably valuable and profitable for their companies. Now, Marco reached out to these former clients with a proposition. What if they could access the same level of analytical expertise that had made Meridian successful, but through a more flexible arrangement that better served their specific needs? He outlined a vision for a boutique consulting firm that would operate with the agility and focus impossible at larger companies, staffed by carefully selected specialists who understood that their success depended entirely on client satisfaction rather than corporate politics. Within 2 weeks, Marco had secured letters of intent from 6 major companies representing over $15 million in potential annual revenue. But rather than present this as his own venture, Marco brought the opportunity to Kessler as a potential salvation for Meridian. He suggested that instead of selling to Titan, they could restructure the company around this new business model, with Marco taking operational control while Kessler retained ownership and focused on strategic relationships with existing clients. Kessler, facing the collapse of his acquisition plans and desperate to avoid bankruptcy, agreed to Marco's proposal without fully understanding its implications. The legal documents were complex, but they essentially transferred all meaningful control of Meridian Analytics to Marco while leaving Kessler with nominal ownership of an entity that no longer resembled his original company. Marco had achieved what amounted to a bloodless coup, taking over an established firm while making the former owner grateful for the privilege of being displaced. The transformation of Meridian under Marco's complete control was swift and ruthless. He eliminated employees whose skills did not match his vision, restructured client relationships to maximize profitability, and implemented systems that gave him total visibility into every aspect of the operation. More importantly, he began positioning Meridian not just as a consulting firm, but as an information clearinghouse for wealthy individuals and corporations who needed intelligence that was not available through conventional sources. Marco's new business model was brilliantly simple. Charge premium prices for analysis that incorporated information his competitors could not access, gathered through methods they would never consider using. His network of contacts in law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and competing firms provided insights that allowed Meridian's clients to make investment decisions with unprecedented confidence. When a pharmaceutical company needed to know whether a competitor's drug trial would succeed or fail, Marco could provide the answer based on inside information from FDA reviewers. When a hedge fund wanted to anticipate regulatory changes that would affect energy stocks, Marco could deliver advance warning through his contacts in various government agencies. This approach generated extraordinary profits while creating powerful dependencies among Meridian's clients. They became addicted to the superior information Marco provided, unable to return to conventional analysis that suddenly seemed primitive and unreliable. More importantly, they became unwitting participants in Marco's intelligence network, sharing their own sensitive information in exchange for the insights he provided. Every client relationship became a source of additional leverage and influence. Marco's personal transformation during this period was as dramatic as his professional success. He had learned to project whatever persona serve his purposes, appearing humble and grateful when dealing with older executives who needed to feel superior, displaying aggressive confidence when negotiating with rivals who respected only strength, or adopting scholarly detachment when advising clients who valued intellectual credibility above all else. This psychological flexibility allowed him to navigate any social situation while maintaining complete emotional independence from the people he was manipulating. The ultimate test of Marco's new position came when one of his former competitors attempted to destroy him through a coordinated campaign of regulatory complaints and media attacks. The competitor, recognizing that Marco had become a threat to the entire industry's established order, tried to use conventional weapons against someone who operated entirely outside conventional limitations. But Marco had anticipated this possibility and prepared defenses that turned the attack into an opportunity for expansion. When investigators began examining Meridian's practices, they discovered that Marco had meticulously documented every regulatory violation and ethical breach committed by his competitors over the past 3 years. Instead of finding evidence against Marco, the investigation uncovered a pattern of industry-wide corruption that made Meridian appear exceptionally clean by comparison. Several competing firms faced serious legal consequences while Meridian emerged with enhanced credibility and a waiting list of clients eager to work with the one consulting firm that seemed to operate with complete integrity. Marco had achieved something that most people would consider impossible. He had built a business empire through methods that bordered on criminal manipulation, yet he was perceived by regulators, journalists, and clients as a model of ethical leadership. This reputation provided perfect cover for operations that became increasingly sophisticated and profitable as his network of influence expanded into politics, media, and international finance. 5 years after arriving in New York with nothing but determination and a willingness to discard conventional morality, Marco controlled assets worth over $50 million and possessed influence that extended far beyond his official business interests. He could ruin careers with anonymous phone calls, create opportunities through strategic introductions, and solve problems that seemed impossible by applying pressure at precisely the right points in complex systems. But Marco's greatest achievement was not material wealth or social position. It was the psychological transformation that made him immune to the fears and limitations that controlled other people's lives. He had learned to view setbacks as information rather than defeats, to treat other people's emotions as data points rather than moral obligations, and to pursue his objectives with the kind of focused intensity that most people reserved for survival situations. Standing in his penthouse office overlooking Central Park, Marco reflected on the journey that had brought him from a basement apartment to the pinnacle of New York's power structure. He had proven that a man with sufficient knowledge, determination, and freedom from conventional constraints could forge a life that no external force could destroy. The storms that broke other people simply provided him with opportunities to demonstrate his superiority and expand his influence. Marco understood that his success would be incomprehensible to people who still believed in fairness, justice, and the eventual triumph of good intentions. But their incomprehension was precisely what made his victory possible. While they waited for the world to reward their virtue, Marco had learned to shape the world according to his vision. While they struggled against systems they did not understand, Marco had become a master of those same systems. The weak would call him a monster, the naive would call him evil, but history would remember Marco Santelli as a man who understood how power actually worked and used that knowledge to build something permanent in a world of constant change. He had forged a life that no storm could break because he had become the storm himself, a force of nature that reshaped everything it touched according to laws that existed beyond morality, beyond sentiment, and beyond the reach of anyone who lacked the courage to acknowledge what human beings really were when stripped of their comfortable illusions.